Good morning and welcome to the Week in Politics. This week, of course, has been budget time and we've got a different format. I'm here today with Robert Tanton, who is from the University's National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling, which has been crunching the figures on the budget. We'll talk about the outcomes from NatSim and also some wider budget issues. Robert, good morning.
Good morning, Michelle.
Firstly, tell us about the NatSim modelling.
So the NatSim modelling that we do uses a complex model that is what we call a bottom-up model, and so it comes from the individuals and families and goes aggregates up to national estimates. So it is very complex. One of the things we have found this year is that we've had to keep it up to date with the latest data that we're seeing from the ABS. And a big shout out to the ABS. They've been bringing out numbers rapidly.
They have done a fantastic job during the pandemic, I must say.
Yeah. And so we've been using all of those numbers that have been coming out. They've been coming out, in some cases, fortnightly numbers. Normally we get quarterly labour force survey. We've been getting more regular estimates using a thing called the single touch payroll system. And so that has been incorporated into our modelling also. So the NatSim team has also had challenges this year just in terms of the data. We've now brought all of that into our model and we have what we now call a nowcasting model. So,
like Treasury's challenges with the assumptions, of course, in this budget.
Yes. And so, you know, that's been an important thing for us.
So let's turn to the results. What have you found?
So what we found is in terms of the tax cuts, and it really isn't a surprise when we look at tax cuts, higher income people are always going to benefit more because they've got a higher income and so they're paying more tax, and so when there's a tax cut they'll get tax more. A tax cut will be greater. And so what we find is that higher income families do gain more in dollar terms from the tax cuts, and lower income families gain less. And obviously if you're unemployed then you gain nothing from the tax cuts, and that's like an important point to be made from the analysis when we look at our tables. And the tables this year, what we've done is we've picked typical families. So we haven't actually used what we call our nowcasting model. We've picked up typical families and used what we call a hypothetical model. And so we've got hypothetical families, run them through our model. And so if both parents are unemployed, then there's no benefit at all from the tax cuts. If there's one parent unemployed, then there's some benefit, but it's not a huge amount.
So for the average wage earner, perhaps a person on a full-time job with a partner on a part-time job, is this a good budget or a bad budget in financial terms for them?
Look, it's a reasonable budget. If you're on a high income, if both parents are on a high income in a family, then they're going to be gaining about $5,000, $4,800 a year, if they're both high income. If they're on an average wage, they'll get about $2,160 a year. If they're on a minimum wage, they'll get about $2,700 because that includes some of the low income tax offset and some of the other benefits that are coming through to low income workers. But again, as I say, if you're unemployed, if you're both unemployed, then there's really nothing.
And of course the coronavirus, which has been the supplement for the unemployed people, is now being phased back, and its whole future is in doubt after December.
Yes. And so the Treasurer, when he was speaking to Lee Sales on Tuesday night, the budget night, essentially said, look, they'll be reviewing that when it comes up. There was no money in the budget to actually do anything with it. And so if you're unemployed, you haven't got a job, and we know that there are a lot more people unemployed now because of the ABS data, then, and in particular industries, then you will get nothing from the tax cuts, and after December you'll be going back to the original, the coronavirus supplement drops out of JobSeeker.
Which of course may be adjusted. I think there's a lot of pressure to do that, isn't there?
I think there is a lot of pressure to do that, and as I say, the Treasurer said on Tuesday night that they'll review it when he was talking to Lee Sales, but you know, there is nothing in the budget specifically to deal with that at the moment.
So a lot of insecurity for a lot of people.
A lot of insecurity for a lot of people, yep.
Can I turn to the macro picture?
Yep.
Do you think the tax cuts will have the effect of stimulating the economy to the degree the government hopes? Because a lot of economists said before the budget, don't go down that route because this money will be, a lot of it will be saved.
Yep. And so we've just released some research this morning, which wasn't new research. It was essentially looking at the academic literature on who tends to spend from tax cuts and who tends to save them. And the national and the international research, so the Australian research from the Reserve Bank and the international research from the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, both suggest that low-income earners will tend to spend the tax cuts, and high-income earners won't spend as much of that tax cut as a low-income earner. And that, it sort of makes sense when you think about it. It's the if you're on a low income and you get another dollar of money, then you'll be more likely to spend that than if you're on a high income and you get another dollar of money. It's what the economists call a marginal propensity to consume. And so that ability to spend another dollar when you're on a low income and spend it on things like, you know, food, books for your kids at school, uniforms, things like that, it goes right back into the economy. Whereas if you're on a high income, you're more likely to put it onto the house loan, put it into superannuation, so it doesn't really go back into the economy, it goes into your savings.
So would it have been better to give more money out in cash? Of course, some money's going out in cash to pensioners and other eligible people, but should that have been more and the tax cuts less, do you think?
Look, I think it was an interesting approach to take the tax cuts from that they designed in 2019 to essentially counter what we call bracket creep, which is as people increase their incomes, they move into higher tax brackets. They've taken those tax cuts that they decided in 2019 and said, oh, let's make them a stimulus payment in 2020. What they probably should have done was to have a look at those tax cuts and say, look, we can adjust them a bit. We can maybe leave the marginal rate at 32.5% rather than reducing it to 30%. Maybe rather than decreasing the cut-off from 120 to 90, we can change that. We might be able to increase the low-income tax offset and try to target it a bit more at low income, but then also make a bit of a saving from that tax cut to then be able to say, well, yes, actually we can extend job seeker now, because as I said earlier, there's a lot of people who are unemployed now who will be relying on job seeker to get food on their table and the kids out to school. And so I think, you know, that sort of idea to adjust those tax cuts slightly, maybe to leave a bit more money to then put into job seeker, might have been a better way to go.
Now, obviously, this budget has had huge tax breaks for business. Do you think that business will respond to those as strongly in terms of its investment as the government hopes?
It's hard to predict what business is going to do with those tax cuts, obviously. I think, sorry, not with the tax cuts, with the
tax concessions.
Tax concessions. And so I think with the tax concessions that have been given to business, it really is going to depend on business confidence. And I always sort of say to people, you know, when they talk about business confidence, I sort of say, well, it's not so much business confidence, it's still confidence of people, because businesses are made up of people, the CEO, the board, and the senior directors in a business. They're all people who are making decisions, and they're going to look at that national environment, the international environment, and say, well, should I be putting money into infrastructure and taking it into account and using these depreciation, the increased faster depreciation or no depreciation, or should I be saving that money? And so I think there's going to be you know, some important discussions at the board level with CEOs as to what confidence do we have in the economy at the moment, should we be bringing forward those infrastructure decisions or should we not? So it is a bit of a gamble by the government to say, we'll provide these depreciation allowances to then sort of be able to say, well, we think that the business confidence will be there, that they will invest in the Australian economy. Hopefully they will, but there's no guarantee.
Well, Keynes talked about the animal spirits, but those animal spirits are pretty depressed and quiet at the moment, aren't they?
They are, and I suppose this is the thing. As I say, the government is relying on that confidence, and there's not much of it there at the moment.
Do you think that we should be worried about debt and deficit? Now, the argument, of course, in general is that there's absolutely no alternative to have this huge budget deficit to go into a lot of debt. The government has accepted that argument, even though it was saying something quite different, of course, when circumstances were different in 2013 when it was elected. But in the longer term, is this going to be a problem? Or given low interest rates, we're able to service the debt, should we just say, well, other things are so much more important that we'll put aside concerns?
Look, I think debt and deficit is not a bad thing as long as you're putting it into the right place. And so if you're putting it into helping people get into employment through something like the job seeker, or putting it into infrastructure projects like NBN, energy, infrastructure, things like that, roads. I think if you're able to say that we're getting a return on this investment, and it's like any business, if you're going to get a return on this investment, businesses are going to be looking at an economic return on investment. I think government needs to be looking at not only, more a social return on investment. And so being able to say, this particular deficit has funded these particular infrastructure, this particular packages that have then helped the economy get back on track. And because when we start getting back on track with the economy, people start getting employed, they move into employment, paying tax more, GST as they spend more, and so that all then flows back to the government to help pay off that debt and that deficit. So during periods of crisis, and we've seen this through GFC, through the recession with Keynes back in the 1930s, that expenditure and going into deficit isn't such a problem because, as I say, it then leads to growth, and as you come out of it, there's this cyclical effect in economics. So I don't think it's a major issue. As you said, low interest rates at the moment mean that the cost of that debt is actually quite low. So I don't think it's a major issue. And as I say, during the GFC, we were looking at a similar sort of issue.
So this is not going to be a problem for the generation now young who've already suffered quite a lot in this recession. It's not going to be a problem for them in the future decades.
I think as long as we've got employment growth and as long as that generation are employed, then, as I say, that then feeds into those tax, GST, tax rates, things like that, and then goes to help fund that debt and to pay off that debt in the future. So as long as we've got a growing economy, then we can service that debt and we can pay off that debt in the future.
Just finally, to turn to Anthony Albanese's budget reply, there was a lot of pressure on him to produce some policy. He outlined plans for an enhancement of childcare and also for modernising the electricity grid. What were your impressions of that speech?
Look, I think it was an interesting speech. I think being in opposition, you do have that opportunity to reflect and think some long-term and some big picture. I saw it as very much a long-term and a big picture sort of speech. And I think when you're doing a budget and you're coping with policy with the coronavirus and things like that, you are sort of thinking very, you know, what are the things that we can do now? Whereas I think the impression I got from Anthony Albanese's speech was that it was much more longer term and bigger picture. And so it talked about infrastructure, it talked about childcare, getting women back into work and things like that. So I think, you know, there were some important things that came out of that speech, which as a country we need to be thinking about, but it did seem to be much more longer term and much more bigger picture. And what we saw on Tuesday was very much more, how do we handle this crisis? Now, I don't think Anthony's speech last night wasn't handling the crisis that we're in. It was just thinking about it much more in a long-term process. And I mean, in some ways, the childcare arrangements are very much, you know, thinking about how do we respond to this crisis. But a lot of the infrastructure stuff was very, and so the energy grid, talked a bit about the NBN, was very much more bigger picture, longer term thinking.
Robert Tanton, thank you very much for today and for your insights. It's been a fascinating week, but let's hope next week's a little quieter.
Thanks very much, Michelle.
Goodbye.
Bye.